Good morning, and thank you for joining us for our annual Social Work Day on the Hill Politics and Policy Forum. I am Charles E. Lewis Jr., the director of the Congressional Research Institute for Social Work and Policy. We had hoped to be meeting in person again this year, but it's not easy doing Social Work Day on the Hill when you're not on the Hill. But it seems that we're slowly getting a handle on the pandemic, and we're looking forward next year to gathering on the Hill. So happy Social Work Day, happy Social Work Month, everyone. Uh, this is a month that we celebrate the contributions of social work to society, and we want to thank social workers for their contributions. So hug a social worker, thank them for their service, make this a special month. It's also Women's History Month, and we recognize the need for everyone to tell their stories from their perspectives and not let others interpret their lives and experiences. How many of you know that the first woman to serve in Congress was a social worker? And do you know her name? Jeanette Rankin. Jeanette Rankin was elected to the House of Representatives from Montana in 1916, which is significant because it was 4 years before the 19th Amendment was ratified that gave women the right to vote. And while we're, looking at what's going on, we want to also recognize the tremendous suffering that's occurring in Ukraine. I've been listening to the people talk about their efforts to get out of the country, the efforts to survive, and it's been heart-wrenching. So our condolences and prayers go out to the millions of people who have been displaced and traumatized. Please join me for a moment of silence. Thank you. As we have for the past several years, we're going to keep our focus on preserving and strengthening our democracy. And we've been having this discussion. It's been an ongoing discussion on responding to the question, can social workers help save democracy? We began that discussion back in 2018, uh, 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 shortly after Donald Trump was elected president. But before we get started, I would like to share a greeting from one of our congressional social workers, Congresswoman Sylvia Garcia, who represents the 29th District in Texas. She's the first Latina to represent a district in Texas in the United States Congress. And you might remember her as one of 7 managers for the impeachment of former President Donald Trump. So let's hear from Congresswoman Garcia.
Happy Social Work Month, everyone. It's no secret social work is essential to healthy communities. That's why it's so important that we as elected officials hear from social workers often. Social workers directly impact communities and neighborhoods on an everyday basis. It's a noble profession that benefits Americans across the country. I know I too was a social worker and legal aid lawyer early in my career. Many of my fondest professional memories come from my days as a social worker. That's why I'm so happy to hear about your virtual Social Work Day on the Hill. The insights and ideas of social workers like yourself are critical to improving the lives of Americans across the nation. Your service truly makes a difference. Thanks for your contributions and your work, and happy Social Work Day on the Hill, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Congresswoman Garcia. One of the responses to the question, can social workers help save democracy, was the creation of the Social Work Democracy Project. It's a 501c3 incorporated entity that we are going to officially launch today. Uh, I will be joined. I am joined today by several of my colleagues who are members of the board of the Social Work Democracy Project, and we will address this question and more. But most importantly, we want to hear from you. We want this to be more of a town hall discussion where you who are watching ask questions and make comments about social work's ability to respond to the challenge. And we ask that you type your questions and comments in the chat box, and we will respond to as many as we can today. We have prepared a short video produced by Katie Schiller, a social work student during her field placement at Sacred Heart University. She's very talented and recently received a Spirit Award. Take a look.
Greetings, my name is Justin Hodge. I'm a faculty member at the University of Michigan School of Social Work, and I represent the 5th District on the Washtenaw County Board of Commissioners. During the past several years, we have witnessed how fragile our democracy is. After numerous attempts to weaken democratic institutions, efforts to suppress voting, and to invalidate a legitimate presidential election, we find ourselves literally on the doorsteps of becoming an authoritarian state. The publication of Nancy MacLean's award-winning book, Democracy in Chains, was a call to action for social workers, as the Duke University historian meticulously presented the story about how libertarians were aiming to change the rules of the game. It was because of this, CRISP raised the question during the 2018 Social Work Day on the Hill event, can social work help save democracy? An ongoing discussion among social work scholars, educators, and practitioners resulted in the decision to move forward with the Social Work Democracy Project, which we are officially launching today. The Social Work Democracy Project is a charitable organization dedicated to educating social workers about United States government institutions and processes by creating and disseminating materials to schools of social work, social organizations, and individuals. The project will provide toolkits for classroom instruction and will host public forums to discuss issues related to democratic process in the United States. The organization will promote the values of civic participation according to the Code of Ethics of the National Association of Social Workers. We have asked members of the board of directors to tell you why they believe this project is a critical endeavor for the field of social work. Please enjoy.
Democracy in the U.S. is in crisis like it's never been before.
When the current efforts to undo voting rights took place, it broke my heart and brought me to tears.
American democracy has become pretty fragile.
When Donald Trump became president in 2016, I prepared myself for the worst.
A shrinking minority of the U.S. population is trying to stay in power by changing the rules, by subverting the democratic process, and trying to nullify the voices of a new, diverse, multiracial, and younger majority.
It is the responsibility of social workers to engage in policy processes in order to further social justice.
We need social workers to be more civically engaged at all levels of government.
We need to recognize that democracy is in deep trouble, figure out what to do about the attack on democracy and our democratic institutions, and then mobilize ourselves and others.
Social workers could elect to personally hold an elected office or engage in policy practice. From the perspective of social work education, we know that only 17% of current social work students report having a strong interest in social policy formation, management, and community organizing.
One of the biggest challenges for social workers is how busy they are, working on all of the other challenges that our clients, the individual clients, families, and communities are facing. Challenges like violence, discrimination, poverty, extreme inequality, substance use, homelessness, and mental health crises. Social workers need to run for office.
We want social workers to know and to understand what is at stake.
Social workers are master connectors. We are naturally positioned to lead and mediate public discourse.
And the slipping away of democracy is because people that we care about, their voices are not being heard. And so that's where social workers need to step up. And if it's not us, who? And if not now, when?
I hope that you're as excited as we are for the Social Work Democracy Project. We look forward to engaging with you over time as the project grows. We'll see you soon.
Yes, we are excited about starting this project and helping galvanize the attention of the social work profession around the need to step up our efforts to preserve and strengthen democracy. If you go to our website at www.chrisinc.org, you can learn more about the Democracy Project. We're just getting started. And you can also download a program for today and tomorrow if you go to our website. So now I'm going to introduce these wonderful people who you've been looking at while I've been talking. And then we're going to give them a chance to talk as well. And we're looking and we're seeing we got viewers from Connecticut, from Johnson C. Smith in North Carolina, Savannah State University, University of Michigan. We're looking forward to all of you weighing in on your thoughts and your ideas about what we as social workers can do to save democracy. So I'm gonna introduce our panelists in the order that they will present. And I'm not going to do it in a traditional fashion. I'm not going to tell you, their rank and the schools that they're working in. You can find all of that stuff out by getting the program, downloading the program, going to our website, and you can just Google them if you want to know a whole lot about them. Well, here I'm going to tell you about why I am so thrilled to be in this company of these three remarkable individuals. I'm going to start with Mimi Abramovitz, who is an icon in the social work profession. And it would take me 20 minutes to go through her accomplishments, but she's one of the few social workers I know with the Wikipedia page. So I was really blown away. And she started her career on women's issues, and then she wrote this. I don't know how this paper. Everybody's on welfare, and I'll never forget. And everybody I know have read this paper in their college classes. And it caught my attention, and I was just amazed. And so it was years later that I got to meet Mimi, and I was thrilled to have met the person who wrote it. So if anybody's got their mic open, please mute it. We're hearing some noises. I just want everyone to get a chance to listen to Mimi and her thinking about what we're facing in this. I'll just close with Mimi. We love to get into these conversations, and we can go on for a while. And we don't always agree, but it is fascinating. And our next panelist is Lena Nepomniachtchi. Not bad. And Lena, you can find out that she teaches at Rutgers, but I've known that Lena from the time we both were in the doctoral program at Columbia University, and I was just impressed with her brilliance and her knowledge and her skills, and so we always kept in touch. But we stayed in touch. So when we were putting together the Democracy Project board, I said I need somebody who really has a good grasp of economics And so Lena could tell you that when you do the doctoral program at Columbia, you learn economics. And so she has done that. And so we're happy to have her here. And she's not going to be able to stay with us through the whole program, but we're happy to have her for the time she's been with us. And the next gentleman is Justin Hodge. And you're going to know more about this young man in the coming years because he is a dynamic guy. And I met him when he came to our boot camp. I believe it was 2019, if I'm not, yeah. And so he, he grabbed my attention right away, and he's been working with us very closely over the course of the last couple of years. He's part of a four-man team that has been working on this democracy project, and we've been meeting like weekly, almost, right? Every Friday afternoon. And he's an elected official now. He's not just a thinker; he's a doer as well. And so I'm gonna be quiet for a minute and let these brilliant people talk to you. Starting with Mimi.
Hello, everybody. And Charles, thank you for that generous introduction. You made my mother very happy. And me too. So I co-chair the National Social Work Voter Mobilization Campaign, better known as Voting is Social Work. And I am really scared by the rising threat to democratic institutions in the United States and abroad. And I'm thrilled that Charles has launched the Democracy and Social Work Project. You know, social workers are good at diagnosing individual and social problems. Yet we, along with many Americans, are not always ready or comfortable with assessing the status of our democratic institutions. We need to up our game. Why? Because democracy, as you've heard already, is at risk. Over the past 10 years, the number of democratic countries fell from 42 to 34, representing now only 13% of the world's population. The US has been described as a flawed democracy and or as sitting between democracy and authoritarianism, described by established organizations that do this kind of ranking. And we have been warned. In How Democracies Die, two political scientists identify 4 warning signs of democracies in trouble. They reject democratic norms or the rules of the game. They deny the legitimacy of political opponents. They curtail opponents' civil liberties, including the media, and they tolerate or encourage violence. Sound familiar? It should. Nearly all of these signs are evident in the United States today. The authors conclude that democracy does not necessarily end with a bang, a violent military revolution, or by a coup. Rather, it ends with a whimper, the slow, steady weakening of critical institutions, such as the vote, elections, the press, the courts, the media, political norms. And a new book, How Civil Wars Begin by Barbara Walters, takes this a step further. The current attack on voting rights has been driven by perceived threats to white supremacy. It includes voter suppression. Now, this is designed to demoralize the electorate. It suggests that the system is rigged, makes people believe that voting does not matter or does not even count. As of January 22, more than half the states have introduced more than 250 bills to suppress the vote, up from 75 bills in 24 states last year. Then there is election subversion, which may be even worse. It seeks to interfere with the administration of elections and override the will of the voters. In 2021 and 22, more than 13 states introduced 41 bills to subvert, overturn, or undermine elections by replacing existing election administrators with highly partisan officials, substituting their preferred candidates for those the voters choose, criminalizing the election certification process, And of course, you've all heard about gerrymandering or redistricting. Well, since the last census, states have redrawn these district lines based on racially gerrymandered maps that systematically disenfranchise Black and Latinx voters. Along the way, the Supreme Court has eviscerated Voting Rights Act, not to mention abortion. Then on January 6th, we witnessed an attempted coup. An insurrectionist mob, falsely claiming that the election was stolen, stormed the Capitol to stop Congress from counting the Electoral College votes. But these threats go even beyond voting. Opponents of democracy have actively stoked hatred, racism, xenophobia, and misogyny to confuse and destabilize society, to sow distrust in each other and in government, and to silence dissent. Here are some examples. Most recently, we are hearing about books being banned. Since January 2022, 30 states have introduced more than 150 bills to restrict teaching about race, gender, or any topic that might make students uncomfortable. These educational gag orders also target higher education and threaten faculty and programs that resist. Social workers, we need to be on the alert. Then there is the less independent press. Between 1970 and 2020, the number of daily newspapers is down 20%. Investigative journalists down 50%. Meanwhile, large media corporations own 80% of all the daily newspapers. Less trust in government, another anti-democratic feature. In 1960, 3/4 of Americans trusted the federal government, always or most of the time. Today, it's less than 25%, an all-time low. So, democracy is on the brink, these data suggest. The stakes could not be higher. Social workers cannot assume that the US was a well-functioning democracy before the Capitol insurrection. Rather, the history of voting rights alone reveals this downgrade by design has been several decades in the making. Even President Biden declared, and this was before Ukraine, that our longstanding guardrails of US democracy have been shaken. They have placed a dagger in the quote of democracy, end quote. Social workers can and must help strengthen our democratic institutions. Why? Well, it's the right thing to do. Second, it supports the profession's mission and social justice values. Third, we are in the right place. Social workers sit at the intersection of the individual and society. We are best positioned to witness the harms brought by a faltering democracy and to bring civic participation into the classroom, voter registration into the field, and human rights into the United States. We can do it. Never forget what has been done can be undone. We can and must make some good trouble, as John Lewis said. We can support fair and inclusive public policies. We can show that government can work to meet people's needs and uphold democratic institutions. We can and must organize. Imagine if all 700,000 social workers each registered 3 people and they registered 3 more and so on. Imagine the impact. No need to imagine. You can be part of history. Join the Power of 3 campaign just launched by Voting is Social Work. And you can find us on votingassocialwork.org. We are asking all social workers to register 3 people to vote, and they ask 3 other people, and so on. So please join us. We just launched this campaign 2 days ago. And finally, I just want to say, I want to remind us what Supreme Court John Lewis Brandeis, 1856 to 1941, told us. He said, quote, "We can either have democracy in this country or we can have great wealth concentrated in the hands of the few, but we cannot have both." Thank you.
Thank you, Mimi. Charles, you want me just to jump right in? It's hard to top what Mimi has just said, what Dr. Bromwich said. There's, she's got a lot to say, and that was all great. I just wanted to kind of follow up on a couple of things, and certainly the Louis Brandeis quote is very meaningful, right? I'll say it again just so we can all hear it. So we can either have democracy in this country, or we can have great wealth concentrated in the hands of a few, but we can't have both. And unfortunately, we are in a place right now, like probably many of you heard, but pretend maybe not, is that we are in such a space of extreme inequality right now that we have not seen since something like the 1910s and 1920s. We have the differences in wealth and wealth holdings between those at the very top and those in the middle are higher than they've ever been, right? The average person at the top in, say, a CEO position is making something close to 200 times more than the median worker, right? These are inequalities that we have never, not for over 100 years, seen. And they are inextricably tied with democracy, right? Because the people who have that wealth and who are at the top certainly have a lot more power in the political sphere, right? They have the voice, they have the ears of the politicians, and that's who politicians listen to on both sides of the political divide. Certainly, one can say that one party has been more aligned with those people because of the policies around reducing taxation and reducing regulation on businesses, which has kind of driven us to these levels of inequality. But I would say that it's pretty easy to make the argument that both parties are very much driven by money, which is rife in our political system. I wanted to say a couple of other things, kind of going off of what other people have said. And I think there's two issues going on. So certainly inequality, economic inequality is a huge issue, right? But in our country, we can't really separate economic inequality from racial inequality. And a couple of people, not a couple, many people have said very, very important things about this, right? So first, I want to just say something. Nikole Hannah-Jones, who is the author of the 1619 Project, the coordinator of that project, and the author of the book that has just come out, the 1619 Project, she makes the case that America was never a fully achieved democracy. She makes the case that America is an incomplete democracy, and that African Americans have been at the forefront of fighting to make it better. And so, quote her, she says, "Our democracy's founding ideals were false when they were written," in the sense that every man is created equal. And Black Americans have fought to make them true. And so the civil rights fights of the 60s have allowed all sorts of other groups to follow in the steps of the civil rights leaders and the civil rights fighters to create rights for women, to create rights for the LGBTQ community, and so on, right? And so that's an important thing to think about, the role of African American communities in bettering our democracy. And then at the same time, thinking about this issue that, that when African American voters and African American communities got some level of equality and got some achievements within the political sphere, there is amazing pushback, right, and backlash. So after our first Black president, much of this voting suppression and voter suppression things really jumped out and began to be created. And so Heather Cox Richardson, who is a historian who has a very great newsletter that she ties every single thing that's happening today to some other point in history, she makes a really great case too, and I want to kind of quote her a little bit. She makes the case that America across its history has swung between the defense of equality during kind of good times, right? During times that we all feel good about, the 60s and other times prior to that, where civil rights were being increased, voting rights were being increased, anti-discrimination legislation was being created. So we swing between that and then the defense of private property. And this is where these two things seem to be problematic. And let me quote something that she has said. I think this kind of tells the story. So our peculiar history of racism has meant that every time it seems we are approaching equality before the law, those determined to prevent that equality have turned people against it by insisting the government protection of equality will cost tax dollars, right? This is where that inequality piece comes in, thus amounting to a redistribution of wealth from those with property to those without. That is, that if poor Americans, those without a lot of property, right, and a lot of wealth, which includes, all lower income Americans, actually all middle class Americans, Black Americans, Brown Americans, Indigenous Americans, when those people are permitted to vote, they will demand roads, schools, hospitals, clean water, a healthy environment. And those can only be paid for by taxes on people with money. And so in this argument, these folks call this socialism, right? And with this argument, those defending their property turn ordinary Americans against each other and take control of our political system. And that is exactly where I think right now we are heading, right? In that these people with very clear needs to keep their wealth are working through politics to turn people against each other and to control the country, right? To control our political system. And those are all very scary things to think about. And I want to go back to one other person who I feel incredibly, sums up where we are in this country very much with a book that she just put out, Heather McGhee, a book that came out just last year called The Sum of Us, The Cost of Racism for Everyone and How We Can Prosper Together. And her theme, right, is that racist policies that have been put into place every time that African Americans have gotten some rights, all of those policies actually hurt everyone. They hit Black Americans and poor Americans first and hardest, but then they affect everyone negatively. And if you think about some of these voting restrictions, it is very clear that they are meant to subvert the votes of Black Americans, of Latino Americans, of Indigenous Americans, of young Americans, of poor Americans, but they will hit everyone, right? And so that's another way to think about it. And just finishing up with social work, what can we do and why should we? Social workers are at the cusp of all of these issues that Americans face. We deal with all of them more than anyone else. And so really, we should be at the forefront of this. And as Mimi said, there's 700,000 social workers in the US, and they represent all of the communities that are being the most damaged by these policies. And we need to speak up and to step up. And so the first thing we can do is to understand what is going on and to raise our voices and to tell our communities what is going on with democracy. We need to work within our communities, particularly those in groups whose voices are being suppressed, to help them access voting, right? To help them get registered, to help those communities get access to the ballot. And they need to advocate with their representatives to protect the vote and to protect democracy. As Representative Garcia from Texas just said, our representatives want to hear from us. Social workers are the only people that actually understand what's going on the ground, what's going on the ground. They need to hear from us. And finally, we need to run for office. Social workers need to be out there and representing their constituents and communities. And that's all. Thank you.
All right. Well, good afternoon. Well, good morning still, everybody. So good to see so many of my students here and social workers from across the country joining us. I want to talk a little bit about what can we do moving forward. That's already been touched on a bit, and we've already heard how bleak some of the situation can look, and I don't want anybody to get discouraged. It's one of the reasons why I got involved in politics is because of my background in clinical social work. So as we think about trying to get social workers to be more engaged in protecting democracy, I want to be very clear that that's for all social workers. So it's not just for, if you're in school right now studying macro social work, it's for you, absolutely. But I really want to try to pull our clinical social workers into this too. So I really got more engaged because I was working for a community mental health system during a time when our governor and state legislature significantly cut the budgets to our community mental health system. And that resulted in so many clients having to be discharged without a clear transition plan. And, that really got me looking at the people that tend to be in these positions of power are not people that have a background in social justice or human services or have an understanding of what things are looking like on the ground. And that's very much the space that we as social workers occupy, regardless of whatever your area of practice is. I frequently would tell my students that I think social workers are the best equipped and trained people of any profession to serve an elected office because of the wide range of skills that we have to develop, ranging from interpersonal work to community organizing, to policy, to politics, to program evaluation, to management of human services. There's not another profession that prepares people for all of that wide range of skills and service delivery at every level. So what we really need to be talking about too is how do we get the social workers that haven't tuned in to an event by CRISP to tune in to an event by CRISP and to figure out ways in which they can be more engaged in working with either their clients or people in their local community, whether it's voter registration or just helping people to be more educated on the issues that are coming up. I mean, I think trying to look at it from the perspective of how do we get people that are already looking at this more involved, take a social worker that's in private practice or a social worker that's working for a nonprofit or community mental health system. A lot of the policies that we're seeing, as we've already talked about, target the most marginalized in our society first. So it's really on us to be able to be educated about those issues and to spread that information to others so that they can be involved and to figure out more ways to get engaged. I've got, of course, I'm a local elected official. I'm a county commissioner. So I've got a bias in favor of local government. And I always am talking to my students about how that's a lot of where the magic happens at. Federal government's incredibly important, but the stuff that's affecting people in their day-to-day lives, a lot of that's coming at your city level, at your county level. And now that we are turning our focus, I mean, we still have to keep our focus on what voter suppression is looking like, but election subversion is this much greater threat. That election subversion is going to be happening, or attempts at election subversion are going to be happening at the local level. And that's why we need to make sure that we have social workers that are engaged in, being poll workers or supporting our elections in other ways and just being involved to make sure that people that are going to work to subvert our elections are not the people that are lining up to get into those positions. That's what we're seeing is that from the group in the country that is working to undermine democracy, the strategy is very much one starting at the local level and taking over from there. So we all need to be involved, and we need to figure out the ways in which that we can do that fit with the rest of your life. A lot of you that are in macro social work, this is your jam. This is what you want to do. So it's easier, I think, for you to fit it in. But this is something that, all of us need to be focused on. We've talked about, economics and racial injustice and how that connects to democracy and flaws in our democracy. In many ways, you could look at any of the social work grand challenges, and there is that interplay there too. Issue in our weekly conversations about that led up to the Social Work Democracy Project and the ones that we continue to have, we're frequently talking about where are these issues that we see in our society that maybe don't overtly look like they affect democracy or related to democracy, and how do they connect? And there's a ton of them. You can name an issue, child welfare, for example, and there are close ties to that between challenges that we're seeing in our democracy, and why, regardless of whatever it is that you're particularly interested in, there's a need for all of us to be involved. So I would encourage everybody to figure out ways in which you can get involved locally and think about how you can get involved nationally too. That's what CRISP is for. We're focused on helping social workers engage at that federal level. But while you're doing that, stay focused on those local elections too, which can be tough. I can tell you that in Michigan, we can have elections right now, this might change, but we can have elections in May, August, November, and if it's a presidential primary in March, that's confusing, right? It's confusing. You don't always know when an election is. And I know those election dates can differ too, depending on the state that you're in. So making sure that you're up to speed on all that's happening and working to connect others with that information too is extremely important. So I'm going to stop there and turn it back over to Charles so we can get into some of these questions.
Thank you, Justin, and thank you, Lena and Mimi, for those insightful statements. We getting us thinking. But we want to hear from you guys out there, the viewers. We want to, ask us some questions if you have any. But tell us your thinking. Is this too big for social work? I mean, saving democracy? That's a major undertaking. Should social workers be thinking about this even, or should we leave it to economists and lawyers and all those other people and we just help people cope with whatever is out there. What do you think that we should be doing? In the meantime, how do we get our voices out there, Mimi? And how do we, there's so much misinformation. Can social workers add our voices to the public discourse in a way that could make a difference?
Well, I guess I wouldn't be leading the National Social Work Voter Mobilization Campaign if I didn't think so. So I just want to say a couple of things that I think speak to that, that I'm responding to some of the information that was just put out. Running for office. So I thought, speaking of resources, some of you may or may not know about the campaign school run by the Humphreys Institute at the University of Connecticut. They just ran the school. There were 100, with Tanya Rhodes-Smith directs that, and we just got a report that 100, and she'll be speaking later in one of Charles's programs, and maybe tomorrow, I think it is. And I think they had 128 schools from around the country and internationally, people in person learning how to run a campaign and run for office. So
not to cut you off, Mimi, but she's going to be speaking shortly because she's going to come on when Lena leaves.
Oh, okay. Well, terrific. I didn't know that. I know she's scheduled later, I think. But
yeah,
anyway.
well, we can improvise.
Terrific. You're really good at that. I know, and that's great. We can all learn from that. The second thing I just want to mention again is the Power of Three campaign that I'd like to urge everybody to get involved in. That's a way to organize social work, to get our voices out into the community. The idea is that it's simple. Register 3 people to vote, whether you're wherever you are, in your community, in the classroom, in the field, then ask them to register 3 more, and so on. And that's where the 700,000 social workers come in. Imagine the impact if we could do that. And I think we can. And especially, so votingassocialwork.org, and then there's, go to the Power of 3, pledge Power of 3, and there's tons of resources and tools to help you do that, including a QR code that's targeted to social workers where you can just register. It's tied to TurboVote, and you can just register voters on the spot, either online or in person. So all sorts of good tools. And the third thing I want to mention is pick up on what Justin said, about bringing the clinical social workers in. I too am a macro social worker by training and career. But if we want to get social workers, those 700,000 social workers involved, 80% of them are clinical social workers. And so it's just urgent that clinical social workers, and I urge any who are listening to this, to see this not as a macro activity, but as a social work activity, that you sit there, you're the ones talking to clients every day, and you are in a position to ask people if they're registered to vote. Most people never even tell us they've never even been asked to vote, and are happy to vote if someone just helps them get there. So yes, I think there are lots of, these are just some ideas that popped into my head as we were talking about how social workers can get their voices heard on ways to protect, if not save, democracy.
You guys have any comments?
I just wanted to jump in on what Justin said about the importance of getting involved at the local level, right? So, many of us start to think about politics. We immediately think of the federal level, right? Running for Congress, or even at the state level, running for legislature. And that's all wonderful, right? But there are so many much more local positions, and that's where you have the greatest power, right? Because it's a small space, and you can wield a lot of power in that small space. So I was just listening to something. There's over 500,000, 500,000 elected positions in this country, right? That's, there's some localities that have sanitation elected officials, right? Library elected officials, and so on, right? School boards, planning boards, community boards. We should be in all of those places.
Okay, so we've had a couple of comments. Dr. Jessica Hare says it's not too big for social workers, and that more emphasis should be placed on political social work. And we're going to talk about a little bit about political social work when Tanya Rhodes Smith joins us. And Patricia Shelley says, the framing presented here, social workers as defenders of democracy, helps students and communities understand our responsibility to step up, act, sign on to the power of three. And then Sadinia Abaste, I hope I got that name right, says social workers should be involved in politics in a non-biased way and helping the community get more education on civil duties like voting and so much more. And I want to focus on that point, because many times when we are engaged in that sphere, in the political sphere, particularly those who are in academia, we're really very cautious and careful to be nonpartisan. And can we really be nonpartisan on some issues?
I would say that is becoming more and more difficult when issues that should not be partisan are being made partisan by one particular party. That makes it very challenging. We shouldn't be having conversations about registering people to vote or just the right to vote itself being a partisan issue, but that's very much the space that we find ourselves in. So I'm all for the piece of it that we need to be engaged in nonpartisan activities. I think all social workers should be doing that. The voter education work is really important. Doing voter registration is really important. But we can't totally shy away from activities that are going to be seen as partisan, because that's just going to limit what you're going to be able to do. It's going to push you into a corner that's just going to keep you from, any kind of engagement. Like the supporting election officials and conducting a free and fair election, if that is being seen as partisan, we will not have a democracy. I mean, that's why we're on the verge of not having one now.
So if I could, let me just add one thing about nonpartisan. Voting as social work is nonpartisan because we are registering people to vote. So what by nonpartisan means we don't ask you or tell you who to vote for. That's what it means to be nonpartisan in terms of voter registration. And you have to be, otherwise the process just doesn't work. However, the profession and any one of us individually who are outside of that work has always been partisan. The NASW takes positions on legislation, organizes campaigns. So I think there's a difference. If we just be careful how we talk about nonpartisan, as you said, certain activities, voter registration, get out to vote, but partisan in terms of changing society and supporting those kind of programs.
Yeah, I'm saying because obviously there are different methods of addressing the same problem. I mean, if you were a Republican, you might want to use vouchers, and instead of having the government provide those services. So if or you may want the child tax credit to be expanded, and one party does and one party doesn't. So do we just stay silent when those kind of issues come up? How do we address that?
I mean, those don't necessarily even seem like partisan issues. Those seem like philosophical differences. And if one party is lining up behind one particular method, okay, maybe it would be seen as partisan. But if we refer back to what's in our code of ethics and what makes the most sense from a service delivery perspective, which social workers would have a good sense of, it's clear on a lot of those examples you gave what we should be supporting.
Absolutely. And I think going back to our code of ethics is a very nice and clean and clear way to make these points, right? Our code of ethics points to us doing specific things, right? Working with specific groups, addressing problems around specific issues, broad issues, right? And if one party is pushing policies that are not in line with those ethics, it's very clear where we should stand.
So I mean, obviously we can stand as individuals, and so that I think the challenge is how do we message in a way so that we can get individuals to respond and not necessarily, it be a stated position on the part of organization or a school, because one of the more difficult things that I've had to deal with is doing congressional briefings because with and having and partnering with different schools, because when you do congressional briefings, they focus on legislation, and usually legislation is introduced by one party or the other. And the way things are now, most of the legislation that we would be supportive of is being introduced by the Democratic Party. So if they have a bill, like for example, we did a briefing last week on a kinship care bill that Congressman Karen Bass is going to introduce sometime this month. But so we were able to talk about that bill because it didn't have a number. All right, if that bill had a number, then social work schools would be reluctant to weigh in on those pieces of legislation. And I'm saying I've had this as an issue, and for me, I'm thinking that I understand that schools of social work are answer to the universities, and it's usually the university policy that pushes the nonpartisan posture, to stay away from politics generally, but always be nonpartisan. And I'm thinking that schools of social work may need to push back on that to get at least some freedom to be able to be more vocal advocates for policy and legislation that makes a difference. Is that a radical thought?
I don't think it's radical. I mean, we are always at schools of social work informing people about the NASW and encouraging students as they consider joining it to join, especially at that student rate. But NASW is out there pushing legislation, like you said earlier. So more advocacy. I'd love to see schools of social work be more engaged in advocacy within their own university, but also nationwide.
Hey, Charles, any more good comments in the chat? Those are great comments we heard before.
Okay, we got one from Mr. Johnson, who says we also have scientific research of evidence that helps us to inform policy.
Right, bringing the academic and the activist together. That's great.
Yeah. Come on, people out there. We want to hear from you. We want to share your comments, share your thoughts.
So maybe is anyone doing any work that they'd be like to share with us in terms of what you're doing in your community or in your agency or your school to either register voters or that you think will help strengthen democracy? Because we really need good examples.
Okay, so while we're waiting for our viewers to come up with some thoughts or questions, let's talk a little bit about the imbalance in our society in terms of race and inequality, because so too often, we want to focus on one or the other. I've had a lot of friends who say if you shouldn't substitute class for race. That if you want to, if you have a mission or goals for racial injustice, that it shouldn't be diluted by issues of class injustice. And I say that you can't do one without the other, because oftentimes people will use race as a division that prohibits a more broad-based economic agenda. I see you shaking your head yes, Elena.
Listen, you want us to comment?
Yeah, we can comment on it, yeah, obviously.
So I think we have to think of the structures of race, gender, heterosexism, and so on as, I call them racism, misogyny, let me call it systemic racism, systemic patriarchy, and so on. And I emphasize systemic because these are power structures. All of them. They divide people, use these characteristics to keep us divided and to distribute resources, wealth, as Elena was saying before, unequally. And so they serve each other. In other words, if you can keep a group of people in low-paid jobs, be they women or persons of color, and you're an employer, well, and you're a corporate owner, you're going to be much richer than those workers. So it reinforces the class system. And the class system also sets up rules and ways of viewing other people. The people in power economically helped us define welfare recipients as welfare queens and people of color as criminals. So the stigmatization of the poor. And they also, the work I'm doing now, it's very clear that they were very resistant to and violently resistant to the organization of workers into unions going back to the 1800s. So people in power want to keep their power and they use whatever means possible. And so I don't think it helps us to debate which is worse, racism, classism, patriarchy, because
I don't think we're debating.
No, I don't think you are, but you said other people do, and I think that.
Well, I'm saying, for example, we at CRISP are very deliberate in terms of making our work multiracial. Okay, so we want to include as many ethnic groups as possible. You want, and so, but I have encountered challenges getting some Black students to be more involved because, quite frankly, they're not excited about working with white kids, and white kids probably, may not want to work with Black kids. But we try to bring this together because I think at the end of the day, we have to bridge those boundaries, because it has to be a coalition in order to make change. Since this has been, we just left Black History Month, and so what I spent a lot of Black History Month doing was listening to, I was listening to Audible books, but I was listening to W.B. Du Bois's Black Reconstruction. Okay, and one reason none of this, like what Lena was talking about in terms of moving to more democratic processes, is because the poor whites and the African American slaves were separated, and if they ever got together, changes might be made. So I'm saying, this is what I'm saying. If we're not careful, race can, thwart some of our efforts to move society to forward entirely. That's my point.
But I think that is the explicit goal of people who want to stay in power. I mean, I think that has been the case in this country, as you say, right from the end of the Civil War, right after Reconstruction, and continuing now, right, the Southern strategy of the Nixon administration and so on. And here we are exactly in that same place. So race is a very convenient tool, right, to crack open groups of people and just divide them. And that's exactly what's happening. I think that's really important, right, to make the case. We have some really good questions. Sorry, I know other people have things to say in the comments about what advice do we give social workers about running for office? But there's a lot of other stuff. So yeah.
I'll start with that one, since I'm a social worker that's run for office and it's working out so far. So I would say you can and you should do it. I think that, starting, particularly because you're focused on things that affect the question is focused on specifically things that affect people's day-to-day lives, you should figure out what is the specific change that you're looking to make or the issue that you're seeing in your community. Figure out what elected office is the most appropriate for being able to solve that kind of issue, and then figure out how do you get closer to that work. A lot of that looks like getting appointed to local boards and commissions. I just finished teaching a class session about looking at local boards and commissions as a way to get more involved, because people tend to have the understanding that Congress people serve on a bunch of different committees. That system is replicated in our state legislatures. We also see that though at local government, with the difference being that there are a bunch of different boards and committees and commissions that residents get appointed to that have some sort of area of expertise. Like for example, before I was a commissioner, I was on our Board of Health and our Community Action Board to advise on health and economic inequality, respectively. So residents are on those, and you advise the local elected officials that serve at those spaces. So I would say look to those, figure out is the issue something that a city council has to get involved with? What is it? The county government? Is it a school board issue? Is it a library board issue? And I would also start getting some more of that political experience by participating with your local political parties. So, from the people who know about the big DNC and RNC conventions when they do the nominations for president or pass the party platform, that party structure is replicated all the way down to the local level. So there are state political parties, there's congressional district parties, there's county parties, and then the Democratic Party goes even more local to have local clubs. So I would say get involved with those too. And then I'll also say, getting that hands-on experience is what's really important. But if you need additional training, there are tons of programs out there to help you do that. So we talked already about campaign school. CRISP has a boot camp. I'm the director of an online certificate in political social work that anybody can do across the world. You can just Google it, or it can be popped up into the chat. Because I know that not every MSW program or BSW program has a focus on policy or political social work yet. We've made that change at the University of Michigan, and I'm hoping more places would do that too. So if you didn't get the training, it's never too late. I like to learn best by doing, so I got a ton of my experience by working with my local Democratic Party and by getting appointed to serve on local boards and commissions.
So, Charles, can I go back for a minute to something you said about and that Lena talked about divide and conquer? Because I just, there's one more thought to add to that. In the hi Tanya, in the historically, you mentioned that working class whites and with emancipated slaves were working together. They were actually fighting over some issue. I can't remember what it was. That's probably had to do with land or something like that. And that time, race, if you think of race as a social construct, race, the idea that they were different by race and that one was taken from the other got implanted in that movement, and it was destroyed. And so, and then when workers went on strike during the early part of the 20th century, what did the employers do? They brought in black workers to break the strike, and they put hostility between whites and blacks. And then come up today, you said the black kids and the white kids don't want to hang out with each other. Well, they weren't born that way. They grew up in a society that taught them to hate each other, or to distrust each other, or to think that one was better than the other. So discourse. One thing social workers can do is try to counter the myths of inferiority, superiority based on race, class, gender, transgender, and so on. And we work with people in all categories. And so we're, again, well positioned to do that. But as Lena said before, the people on the top deliberately, intentionally, by design, make us want to separate us because it's to their advantage and to our disadvantage. And even if everyone at the bottom had power, there are more of us than them, so to speak. And so they've been afraid of us since the days they were writing the Constitution and didn't want people to vote and only wanted people with land to be active in the democratic process. So it's a long history, and I'm glad you mentioned it because I think we forget it. We forget that what we have today is by design and historically embedded in our country's DNA, and we're going to have to do something about it.
So I think this question kind of sums up what I was trying to say. how can we as social workers be that bridge? How do we begin to break down some of those myths and barriers? And I have a solution that I'm going to share with you in a few minutes, but I'll just throw that out there.
Well, since Tanya's here, can Tanya get
it? Let's for those who may not know, this is Tanya Rose Smith, and she is the director of the Nancy A. Humphreys Institute for Political Social Work at the University of Connecticut, and a good friend. She put me up one night. So and she's always at our boot camps, and she's always with us when we do our events on the Hill. And yes, I have been to the campaign school many times, and hopefully look forward to the chance to get there again. So Tanya, why don't you say hello to our audience?
Hi, everyone. It's so nice to be with you, and always love being in the spaces with this panel and you, Charles. So thanks for including me.
Okay. So how did you respond to this?
So did you want me to, were you asking me?
Sure, anybody. No, this is yeah. You too, please.
Well, I think this is one of the questions for our time, and it's actually something we leaned into at the campaign school last weekend. How do we work with folks who disagree with us, or how do we bridge people of different backgrounds? When do you create the bridge and when do you burn the bridge? But I think as social workers, we don't get to choose our clients, and we know how to listen. And I think one of the things we heard a lot was really understanding and connecting on pain. Pain is universal, and it's not a zero-sum game. And that seeing each other, seeing our humanity is really, for me, the place to start. And certainly, we all have to think about our own positionality and our own, what we bring to any space, and in terms of putting ourselves out there. But I think that's really a place where I often start is I see people's pain, which is not, which really is universal in many ways. So that's where I'll start it now and pass it on.
So, yes, I totally agree. And at the same time, at any one moment in time, we also, we have to work at different levels. We have to work at different levels of, just like different levels of government, different levels of interpersonal issues and social issues. And we definitely need more humanity and connection around what we share. That's what all of us, someone mentioned that, Lena mentioned all of us, that when one person gets hurt, everybody gets hurt. So that's totally true. But we're also in a period of extreme ideological polarization. And my worry is that when we try to do that, people say, oh no, that's not true. And they come in with the ideological socialization that they, or miseducation that they've been receiving day and night from everywhere. And it's impossible to escape. So we have to both deconstruct that ideology and while connecting with people around their lived experiences. And so, we're talking here about big picture stuff, democracy, inequality, and we're talking about running for office. And those are the same thing. They were educating and saying how to do things. And I think that if we do just one and not the other, we're going to fail. And, we try all the time to put them together. And I think I think social work, we're macro and micro, and we're macro, micro, all in one. And so we really are well positioned to do that. But I frankly don't think the field has paid enough attention to these issues that the Democracy Project and the campaign school and the issues that Justin's talking about local activism require. So we're back to the question, Charles, how to bring this into the field. Everyone on this panel is trying to do that day and night. So how can we maximize our efforts? How can we expand our efforts? And maybe some people in the audience can make some suggestions of how we can reach people that you're trying to reach, that you're having trouble to reach, because we're all facing that dilemma. We're reaching lots and lots of people, more than we ever did, because we're trying. But what else can we do? So maybe there's some advice from the audience about what we could do.
Yeah, I would say these are difficult issues to talk about. Okay, and certainly we're not, even if we're talking about it, we're not going to necessarily solve them, right? But I think in order to at least make some progress, we got to think about it, and we really got to do some serious thinking about it, and we really got to do some serious discussions about it. Those of us who are brave enough to want to go into those waters, because it's not easy. It's very difficult. I mean, the boys said this was going to be the defining issue going forward for this country, and he was right. Now I didn't really believe that when I back in the 60s, 70s, because we were looking like we were making progress, But there's always somebody waiting in the wings to try to disrupt that progress. So that we have to be vigilant.
Charles, can I add one? Oh, sorry.
Sorry,
go ahead.
Tanya, go ahead.
No, please. I didn't want to interrupt. Go ahead.
I was just going to say that I think it's important for us and for the audience too to think about what space in the work we all want to occupy, because there are certain things that some of us can do and some things we won't be able to do. I could just say for myself as an example, now as a partisan elected official, there are a lot of conversations I just can't have with people because of that part of my identity now in that positionality, where maybe I could have gotten through or maybe had some sort of transformative conversation across divides that I just can't do now because of the title. And figuring out what space do you like being involved in, and then really leaning into that. Because if we look at the whole tapestry of things that's wrong with democracy in the world, we're going to get burned out because we can't handle all of them.
I agree with that, Justin. And I love that you're in local office, because I also think that that's where we really need to start when we're having these conversations. I mean, when we look across the country on the fact that, really the power base for all of these attacks that we've seen on our rights has been at the state and the local level. And when we look at the number of people who vote in local elections, especially, I mean, it is sometimes in communities, and we can see, you can overlay like arrest rates or incarceration rates with voter turnout and see, a devastating effect on the foundation of civic life in many communities across America. And so when my students occasionally, and I hear it more and more, my vote doesn't matter, which we know is manufactured. The elections are rigged. All of those narratives that are intended, as Mimi said, to divide and make us stop paying attention. The local level seems to me to be the most accessible and actually to build back that trust. I think of voting as being about a relationship, your relationship with government, your relationship and trust in systems. And I think that is also where we start, is on the local level. And that's the one where not only do fewer people vote, fewer people understand their local government. And I think what we see is that it's actually really a nonpartisan issue, because in some communities, when you have one power or one party, even if you think it's the party that represents you, concentrated power is really toxic for communities and really not in the best interest of most people. So yeah. I would just add that local piece.
While you're talking, I keep local levels up flashing in my mind are the pictures that I've seen on the news of local school boards. Mm-hmm. And so the right has gotten very good at that. Way back here in New York, there were local fights, but between teachers and the Black community way back. And now they're trying to, I mentioned banning books earlier in my talk. Well, banning books is taking place at the local level. They're requiring, everyone knows what's going on. I won't repeat it, but the right seems very well organized. to do that. The people who support banning books, let me not say they're all on the right, people who support banning books are well organized, or they have some money behind them that's helping them to organize that. My guess is that it's not as spontaneous as it looks. So we have to be able to do the same thing. Not all those people ever were active before. They just showed up at those meetings. So we can show up at town halls. We can show up at meetings. Running for office is a big deal. You need money. So yeah, we should try to do that as much as possible. But the average person's not going to do that. But they can show up. And local politicians can encourage people to show up at meetings, or community organizers. And certainly social workers and the profession can make a point of this.
I just wanted to just focus on this comment before we move on, because I think it's a really, really important comment, that having people who actually have experienced things helps break down power barriers. And that's not just race, okay? When we did the kinship care briefing, we had people who went through the foster care system, who were in the foster care system, so they could speak to the realities of being there better than those of us who could, collect the data and then crunch it and try to come up with some explanations. All right. So I didn't want to go past this without looking. My technician, can we cue up that graphic that I had asked you to get?
By the way, while you're waiting for the graphic, that's why I asked for people in the audience who are listening to talk about their experiences trying to protect democracy, just for the reason that Elizabeth Monk mentioned. Okay,
I just want to, this is like a word from our sponsor. One of our longtime supporters and sponsors is the Council on Social Work Education, and their God will be starting this campaign on Share Your Stories on why the time is right for social work. So I would imagine that you can go to the CSWE website and find out more about this. Thank you. All right. So, as we move forward, I want to shift our focus a little bit let's talk a little bit about what we're going to talk about more this afternoon, Tanya, in terms of the future of political social work. Tell us a little bit about what happened at the campaign school this year.
So there was a lot of hand-wringing and sleepless nights about whether to be in person, but we pulled it off. And as Mimi said earlier, we sold out. We had 120 students from across and social workers from across the country, and 8 from Germany came. So and I have to say, one, I think we missed the connection. We were virtual last year, but we really missed being together. And this was the first year that we had really sophisticated questions about what it's like to be in political spaces. And like Mimi said, not everybody wants to run, although we have 2 students at UConn who both ran while they were students, one who's serving on school board and one who's serving as a board of aldermen in her city. And so they make it really accessible for students, but also just, their commitment to work on campaigns, to look around, to start at their own party committees and see that there's a lot of people missing in these spaces. So there was a lot of great energy, and I see we had students from many of the people that are chatting here today, and it was very special, and I think there was a real commitment. We also launched the Power of 3, and we talked about the role both of participation and representation, but really that it will always be an incomplete democracy until we have an inclusive democracy. So
okay, so one of our viewers want to know what's the difference between the Humvees Campaign School and the Chris Political Boot Camp, and maybe Tanya is the best person to talk about that because she's been to both. But I'll just say that we do ours is like a 4-day training, and I think you guys do like a two day training, right? And ours is patterned off of the Congressional Black Caucus, their political boot camp, which I attended. And I said, wow, I want to take this to social workers. And so it's just a little more intensive. And we haven't had one in a couple of years because it has to be in person, Tanya. I mean, we've got to have that networking and that face-to-face meetings, and because the camaraderie there makes a major difference in the experience that people have at the boot camp. And since Justin's going to be managing that next boot camp, why don't you say a few words?
Oh, okay. Well, I'm looking forward to figuring out how we go about making it a success after a couple of year hiatus. This is one of the big things that CRISP does in addition to the event that we're doing right now. So stay tuned for more information.
Okay. Thank you.
I think you said it well, Charles. It really, the boot camp is really for those folks who are ready to run and lead, and is much more intensive. We really get them thinking about themselves as leaders, which is a long runway to, sometimes. So,
and even in a 4-day training, I mean, there's only so much information you can give people, but you can at least get them thinking, and then point to where they can get the information, and then give them some tips on. So like tomorrow, we're going to be doing our Student Advocacy Day on Hopin, and we're really excited about that prospect. And so we have a number of workshops that are going to be geared to helping young social workers, get more information in terms. We have one that former Congressman Ed Towns is going to be doing, called Mapping Your Path to Congress. Maybe you should take that one, Justin.
I'm going to tune in for that one, yeah.
But, interesting. Tanya, I don't know if you remember Darrell Campbell, who came to the first. He's now a state rep in Florida. Yeah, wonderful. I mean, so we've had a few successes in terms of getting people to actually. So from a profession standpoint, what does it look like? I mean, do you think political social work is going to be a big thing in our profession?
Well, I sure hope so. At Silberman School of Social Work, I've been teaching. We still run community organizing as a method, which is the closest thing to political social work that we have, and it's probably, very few people teach political social work, except maybe at UConn due to Bob Fisher and Nancy Humphreys and now Tanya. There's their own tradition of political social work there, but there's always been community organizing, and which grew during the 60s when there were pressure from social movements for social change, and then in addition, there's policy practice. Probably even more than community organizing, policy practice has developed in the school. So. I think there's, I don't know the numbers, but I think there's a foundation and a basis for this, plus all the extracurricular work that we've just been talking about. And so I think it behooves us to expand this as much as possible. And I think projects like this, all the projects that we were all involved in, I think contribute to that and excite people and make them want to, if they're students, learn more about it in school and outside of school. So on the other hand, I'm very worried about what's happening in that the silencing of dissent that is coming from state governors, like from Florida and Texas and other places, that is scaring people. The Chronicle of Higher Education has been writing articles about, and I use the term, educational gag orders that are coming into higher education. So if you're coming up for tenure and you want to train social workers for this work, and your university or even you just read about it, I better not talk about that because someone's going to think I'm partisan, or someone's going to think I'm making students uncomfortable. So, and just let me say that I also work with the Social Welfare History Group, and we put out bibliographies. We put out one on the pandemics, past and current. And we're now working on what they call red scares. That is silencing dissent historically. And we have found a record of so many social workers who were silenced during the McCarthy period and earlier, and lost their jobs or feared dissent. So we really have to put up a blockade against that kind of thing taking root. And if we become less democratic and more authoritarian, silencing dissent is the name of the game. I mean, if we're watching what's going on internationally now, not only more and more countries authoritarian, but we're watching how people are not being allowed to have information, much less express their views in the middle of this almost World War III situation we're in. So I think we're both, it's a struggle. There's always a struggle between these forces, the forces of, I don't want to say good and evil because I don't mean it that way, but people who want a social change and people who want to silence the change. And the people, as Lena said earlier, the people who control the instruments of society have the power to shut us down, ban our books, buy up 80% of the press are owned by corporate hedge funds or corporate media corporations. We have fewer investigative reporters. People don't trust the government. There's been a huge amount of success. So yeah. We have to, I just want to say, Charles, we got to get this democracy project up and running fast and furiously because
we're working on it.
We have to counter all that.
Yeah, but I think this is a really poignant comment in the box there because, one of the things we say all the time is that everybody doesn't have to be a political social worker, but every social worker needs to be political, meaning that you don't have to focus what you're doing in the political arena, but you need to be engaged. Even if it's nothing more than being a voter, a regular voter, and encouraging other people to vote. And the more engaged you are, we feel that the more influence we're going to have as social workers. But sometimes we do forget that this profession can be very demanding on social workers, and I think that we have to be careful. Than just telling social workers you need to be more politically engaged. That we have to take this into consideration as we're working with social workers. And I'm not saying I know how to do that, but I'm just saying that we need to say, wait a minute, before we start, because it's almost like we tell them you need to be more engaged in the political arena, and then when they're not, because they just don't have that energy left, they might feel to themselves that they're somewhat falling short. You want to speak to that, Justin?
I mean, absolutely right. I mean, like I talked about earlier, with us trying to pull the 80% or so of social workers that are doing clinical practice into this work, a lot of that is going to be them trying to figure out how do they fit that in to what their day job is. And it's pretty hard. I mean, when I was doing clinical social work, my political engagement was what I had to do outside of my job. And it makes for really long days. But in some ways it can be pretty helpful to be able to just shift the kind of thinking that you're doing. And in some ways that can be reinvigorating. But that's true. I mean, we also need to be advocating for our social workers that are doing that kind of work and social workers that are doing practice across the whole continuum for higher pay. We need to, urge NASW to fight hard so those insurance reimbursements would be higher. One thing that, was an issue was that my next door neighbor when I was working for Michigan Medicine was a psychologist, and they were able to provide the exact same service, but they would bill insurance for higher. So that's and that affects social work pay. So that's something that we need to be thinking about. And that's also a political issue or an issue where there could be some advocacy around that.
So, Charles, I want to add something to that that's a little more systemic about what's going on. Jen Zelnick and I have been writing a lot about something called managerialism, which refers to bringing the business model into social work agencies and organizations. And it's a complicated issue, but basically the things that were mentioned, burnout and low pay and sort of having to document everything you do and everything being measured has inserted itself into social work practice, making many social workers feel that they can't do the social work they were trained for because of the working conditions and the way service is organized. We've had a couple of articles published recently in Social Work if anyone wants to find out more about this. But it's one of these problems that also affects the universities. This business model is affecting tenure and promotion. It's affecting evaluations in agencies. It's affecting the inability to get involved in political social work because you can't get, if you're a professor, non-tenured, you want to get funded, it's going to be very hard. This business model doesn't encourage funders to support that. You have to do NIH, health research. And that isn't always very social change oriented. It could be, but it isn't usually. So we talked about systemic classism, racism, patriarchy, and we have something about that, all those things sort of insinuating themselves into the organizations in which we work, affecting our working conditions and our ability to produce what we want. So it's another issue that instead of, we have to get all our organizations to fight, like you said about NASW, but if social workers accept that social work is sitting in front of a computer and typing in histories and then referring someone to one little thing because nothing else is available, we have to make social workers realize that that's not what we're about. We're about much more than that. But the agencies, their supervisors and the agency directors are pressed by funders to do these narrowing activities. So the universities are being narrowed, the agencies are being narrowed, the center is being silenced. So I think we have to realize the context that we're in because that makes people feel demoralized. But as I said at the end of my talk, never forget what's done can be undone, and that's what's going to give us the spirit to move on.
Okay, this is going to be our last question because we got to take a break before our next session. I think we'll let Tanya answer this because I'm sure you get this question, frequently with the social workers you're dealing with.
Yeah, and so the first step toward a career in political social work. Well, the good news is there's, you can social work applies to so many fields, and it's also kind of overwhelming. But I think just to pull in the last question, I think this is about our network. In Connecticut, we've been doing this for so long at UConn that we have a huge, deep bench of political social workers, and that allows us to build a network for change. So when we think about clinical social workers who want to bring their expertise to the political process, well, they have a network. They know the social worker who's at the Connecticut Coalition to End Homelessness, who is full-time doing policy work. So I, as a clinical social worker, don't have to be an expert. And I think that's really, where we start to expand our full impact. And I think for anybody who wants to start a career in political social work, I would say your first step is to start volunteering on campaigns and start to volunteer and meet with organizations who are doing political work. So it's a huge answer, or it's a short answer to a longer conversation. But I would say take your first.
Yeah, and we invite you to join us at 3:00 when we might be able to get into it a little deeper. So I'm going to ask each of our panelists to give us their brief epilogue for the day. Just tell us what's your last words of wisdom for our audience. Starting with Justin and then Mimi and then Tanya.
Yeah, I'd say it's never too late to start getting involved. As I mentioned earlier, I direct an online certificate in political social work, and I get people that are approaching retirement that had been doing clinical social work and that want to just make the shift now and start to build some more of those skills. And then in our MSW program, I'm the faculty lead for our policy and political social work pathway. So we're trying to get more students at the beginning of their academic career and then people that are needing continuing education to keep more social workers in this work and train more people to do it. I'd say look beyond just what you see in the headlines at the national level, because so much of what's going to affect you day to day is happening, probably right down the street at your city council meeting or your county commission meeting. So figure out how you can get involved there. I mean, as we've seen with school boards and the attacks that health departments have received, all that is local. And that's a much easier way for each and every one of you to get more involved.
I would say, I'll repeat what I said, one thing in my talk. Never forget what's been done can be undone. And that speaks to all the things I've been referring to, all the big picture things I've been referring to here. They can be undone. We just have to do something about it. My second point is don't mourn, organize. It's an old union phrase, but it's something that we should take to heart. And anyone can organize. All the ways all the things we've been talking about equal organizing. So don't mourn, organize. And third, be part of history. Join our Power of Three campaign, votingassocialwork.org. Register 3 people to vote and ask them to register 3 more, and so on.
I am going to echo those words and say the world is run by those who show up. So, look in all the spaces you're in and see who's missing from the conversation. Invite them in. Democracy is about relationships. It's about conversations, and it's about action. So take your first step, and that will lead to more.
Thank you. I want to thank all of our panelists for your insightful comments and thoughts today. And thank you all for joining us and to get this conversation started. We're just getting the conversation started. Can social work help save democracy? Obviously, I believe it can. I believe we can, because we have the Social Work Democracy Project. But thank you again for joining us, and please visit our website for information, and we encourage you to come back at 3 o'clock when we'll be talking more about the future of political social work. Have a great afternoon.